From Chicago, welcome to 3Degrees Discussions. I'm your host, Mike Vasquez. This is a podcast devoted to the stories behind the innovators, entrepreneurs, and leaders in the 3D printing industry.
A couple of bits and pieces of some polymer stuff, but I'd never really paid attention. But because I was in a metals technology role and I was working on qualification of aluminium, we talked about alternative processing, and my line manager just said, we can print aluminium powder here. I was like, what is this? Witchcraft. Let me see. So it was, I was dragged in front of an EOS M270. And that was my first real interaction with what is 3D printing proper.
That's Robert Higham. Robert launched Additive Manufacturing Solutions, AMS, in 2017. He's a chartered engineer and has experience across academia, motorsport, space, and aerospace. Robert was responsible for qualification of materials, processes, and parts produced by additive manufacturing, most recently for Airbus, before creating AMS. AMS was designed and aims to bring aerospace-grade qualification, validation, and operation capability to all corners of industry, and at its core aims to support the industrialization of additive manufacturing. To do this, he's building a team that uses experiences to support AM strategy, validation, and training. Most recently, AMS has launched an agile R&D service to bring knowledge, capability, and outputs of an aerospace-level R&D lab to any customer. Before we get started, head over to www.3degreescompany.com and subscribe to the podcast. Remember, you can listen to the show anywhere you download your podcast, including Spotify, Apple, Amazon, or Stitcher. Also, if you or your company are looking for materials, qualification, or general additive manufacturing support, reach out to our team through our website or via email at info@3degreescompany.com. Hey, Rob, great to have you on the show today. Excited for the conversation. I think we'll go in a lot of different kind of zigs and zags throughout the day, but I like to start all these conversations just with a little bit of grounding and kind of a placeholder to at least come back to. So where were you born? Kind of what were some of those early days like in terms of getting you on the path to where you are today?
That's an interesting start, Mike. I wasn't expecting you to go all the way back there. So I'm English. I'm not just very good at accents. I'm born and raised in a really small city called Preston. So if there's any soccer or football fans, Preston North End is relatively famous, one of the very oldest football clubs. That's probably the only thing everyone's ever heard about Preston.
A good friend of mine from uni was from Preston as well.
Wow, what a small world. We do get around. We do try our best to escape. So born and raised in Preston. I have a younger brother, and I guess as kids, my dad passed away when I was very young. So as kids, we were all about craft. We were all about trying to play with things. And I think that's probably one of the things that really stuck. The only real significant moral I always remember from my mum was always just try, but also follow your gut and have fun. And she never really put too much pressure on me to be anything other than what I wanted to be. And Preston is the heart of British Aerospace or BAE Systems. So anybody who was somewhat capable of maths and science at school, that was pretty much the only route that you was taught about in school was, you should go and do an apprenticeship with BAE Systems. And I followed the well-trodden path. And that's where I started post-school at BAE Systems. I was an apprentice. So you start off on the shop floor, you do lots of manufacturing. And I think to this day, despite the time I had there wasn't too long, and it was a really poor time. It wasn't too long after 9/11. There was a lot of turmoil worldwide, in particular in the aerospace industry. But the practical grounding, just to have stood somewhere, riveting a thing, I think that slight mechanical sympathy has been a common thread of something that I've always wanted to try and stay true to. But also, I do think it's helped in terms of, as we fast forward all the way to today, that additive manufacturing focus, which we're obviously going to talk about, but that understanding of what happens when these things go together, how do we do it, and that little bit of sympathy, I think, is so important as a grounding. What about you, Mike? Maybe you and I, have you got that same kind of mechanical sympathy? Is that a common thread, do you think, in additive people?
Yeah, I mean, as a materials engineer, I mean, I probably told this story before on the podcast, but I mean, the reason I got into materials engineering, is because I like to play baseball and I like to see the different types of baseball bat materials they'd come up with every year, right? Some years it'd be aluminum, and then graphite, and then carbon fiber, and all these different alloys. And so I got to go make baseball bats one of my internships, and I thought that was awesome, and kind of see the behind the scenes of that process, and see how long it actually takes, and not just hey, here's a spreadsheet that has how efficient or the time cost model, right? It's like real people that are behind all these numbers, and that a lot of people, as you get further and further away from the shop floor, make decisions on without much visibility into. So I think always connecting and appreciating that that level of context for either people you lead or people you work with is always very important.
Yeah, and I know it's the same context, and there's lots of other people we could name drop, and I'm sure you've spoken to over the years in terms of there's always a link to a product. We're always inspired by a product, and I think for me with Additive, I know we're maybe fast forwarding 20 something years from where we were just talking, but there's a picture on the wall behind me here of a Harrier jump jet, and that product was an inspirational thing, and I think having a link to a product from passion or intrigue or whatever it is, I think that's pretty common. And Additive feels, I don't know, more tangible. It's a product. It's a thing which is visible maybe in some way, which some of the products, like you say, spreadsheets and leading people are not.
Yep. And do you remember what your first thing you kind of worked on professionally in like the aerospace industry? I mean, if it's top secret, you can't say, but like what were you actually doing on the shop floor back in the day?
So I mean, beyond the everyone made the same old thing for a training kind of gig, and they make you sit in Harrier air intakes and wire lock upside down and back to front, all of those things where I look at and I don't even understand how I possibly fit in that anymore. But beyond that, I think the first real job I remember, I hated, and it's because it just took so long, and it was replacing brake pads on a Tornado, and it was like a week job, and that was a week job because the people I was working with had no drive, no passion, they just didn't care. And I remember it vividly because the same week we were messing with these brake pads all week, and we were an apprentice, so we were there to learn, and we were there to ask questions, or in reality, don't ask questions, just try and not get in the way. But the RAF came in and they did a full wing swap in a day. Well, it was a working day in hours, and I think that always sticks out to me for that reason. And then the most enjoyable role, I think, not long after that was when I got onto Harriers and we were doing some advanced targeting system work. But as an apprentice, I was involved. We were fitting them. We were taking data from the aircraft. We was talking to the test pilot. That for me was quite an inspirational moment. But also it was the moment I decided to leave, and I decided to leave because there were so much restrictions about what we were and were not allowed to do. And actually, I felt like when you're passionate about something and you're not allowed to go and do it to because of time or whatever the constraints were in the way, that for me was one of those first. My mum always said, follow my gut. And it was just, something's not right. And I was worried, even as a 17, nearly 18-year-old kid, and I was a kid, I was worried I was just going to have all the drive knocked out of me. So that's when I made the decision to walk away from the thing I loved, and I've had pictures of them since rather than gone and worked on them. But that gut feeling has always been the thing. And there's so many people who want you to, or certainly over here and in those days, they want you to calm down and wait your turn. And that was never for me. So we ran off and did some other things and looped around. And that's when we went to university, because the kind of vocational apprenticeship from high school is quite common in the UK. So then I went to university beyond that after a couple of years of soul searching and figuring out what do I like, what do I not like. And that's when I eventually stumbled into engineering. I say stumbled into, I was kind of, I knew it intrinsically, but I was never involved in the spreadsheet side and all of those things. And that was actually a bit of a accident, I guess. It was motorsport engineering I studied. but it was a logical thing. I've been practical. I've worked with design. I've done some of these bits, and I think maybe I was just at a transition point to the way that we call things these days, where it's pretty obvious everything is kind of engineering, and now we're asking for practical engineers. And in those days, you had to be practical to become an engineer, and that was quite an interesting route for me. And I think I look now as a with education, and I think, well, sure, that's the way it should be. Like, we should force people to do this, but hey, maybe it's a separate podcast conversation on the educational requirements. So that's where we went. Then we went to university and studied motorsport engineering, and then I went to Airbus as an intern, and that was when I was put in front of this big fridge-looking thing that had powder and lasers in, and then I guess from that point, here we are, 10 and a bit years later, and the rest is kind of history-ish.
Did you know, like, when you were kind of at that transition point, when you were kind of getting that internship and kind of your first job, how were you going about like finding those roles, or was the university pretty good at kind of matching people up? I think one of the questions I always get from people that may be outside of engineering or even outside manufacturing is like, where do I even start? Right? There's a big manufacturing is huge, engineering is huge, right? Many, if like I'd say 95% of the companies are small companies, and then you have the big Airbus and Boeing and all the big manufacturers as well. But how did you get your start? Like, did you have a company in mind? Did you have an aerospace where somebody kind of pushing you? Like, do you remember kind of the mindset you had back then?
I remember the mindset for sure, and we had so the kind of our employment focused lecturer, I guess you would call him. He basically argued with me. I was a few years older than the rest of my cohort because I'd been at work before going to university. So I was kind of saying, I just need to get this degree and go and figure something out later. I'm already, however old I was 23 or whatever. I was like, it's just, this is, I'm already old. I should probably just rush this certificate. And he said, please just apply for some jobs. It will do you the world of good to do some interviews. I was like, okay. So that was what started it. And then actually, I was always quite competitive with university in terms of wanting to make sure every percent lower than 100 was for me a frustration. So I then wanted to win the applications in some way. And I remember feeling like, you know what, the more I looked at them, the more I wanted to answer the questions, and I wanted to push myself. And I was always maybe through age and a bit of wisdom and work experience and life experience, I was certainly more interested in thinking about what were these questions asking me. But it was pretty much always large aerospace, large automotive, or motorsport supply chain companies I was applying for as interns. And I applied for God knows how many. And I've said this for many, many years since then. I genuinely don't know why I carried on to that extent while still studying and all, doing my own assignments and things. But there was something about the application game and the wanting to be offered some jobs or wanting some interviews for experience. And in the end, Airbus was my first interview. They offered me the job before my second interview was ever offered for any other company. I accepted it, and then I rejected quite a few, which was a nice little ego massage, I guess. But I was rejected from 70-odd companies in the end, I guess, because they never offered me a thing. So, in many ways, I took the first one, but the first one was a real big fish, and I thought it would be quite good. And I think I needed that. I was, by number, I was a bit more mature, but I think I still needed a large company as a buffer just to help me with my own development. I was certainly, I certainly benefited from the large company mentality, though obviously it's not lasted because I'm not there anymore, but it certainly helped me early on. And I do say to quite a lot of students and high school as well as college and universities, that bit of work experience in a large company to give you that time that big companies can give you, because no one's quite as busy in a big company as they are if they're in a small consultancy firm as a one-man band. That was really beneficial. And that's why the large companies have such huge turnover of staff, because they put that time in.
Yep. Did you ever think, I mean, like, I think one of my first internships was with 3M, so another massive company. And so there were a lot of folks there that had been there 15, 20, even 30 years. Did you ever, like, when you first started there, and probably I imagine you see and meet a lot of folks that had been in that, like in the company for that a period of time. Did you ever imagine that would be you?
No, yeah, I met a lot of those folk, and no, I don't think I ever imagined it would be me. I managed to have some additional levels of self control when I was at Airbus, and I appreciated the significant step there was in the amount I had to learn between what I was. I was getting good grades at university. I thought I could be an engineer, but the reality of how to act as a professional engineer and the understanding of so many other facets I was thrust into materials technology, which wasn't something I particularly wanted to do. It wasn't that I didn't want to, but it was not necessarily the area that I was specialised in with university. But you kind of get the internship you go, but actually for me, all of a sudden then, okay, we need to understand everything about our process. Then what is metallurgy, and then what is statistics, and I realised at that point, like, oh hell, this is not individual modules anymore. But that was, for me, that was right. I need to try and figure out how do I become useful enough to do this without necessarily needing to be here so long that I become an encyclopedia of what's happened for the last 40 years. And it was never my personality to stay put, but it wasn't my intention to leave. My intention was to move around the company, try and travel and live all over Europe. I was lucky I had a chance to live in Germany for a while. It was a wonderful experience. But I think, the same role for 30 years time was never going to be me. And I don't know why. I genuinely don't know why. But it was never going to sit.
And what was it like seeing your first 3D printer? Was the metal printer the first 3D printer you'd ever seen? Or like, did you just like jump in the deep end? It's like, hey, I'm going to like go big or go home, or had you seen kind of incremental?
Pretty much. Yeah, pretty much. So I'd seen a couple of bits and pieces of some polymer stuff, but I'd never really paid attention. But because I was in a metals technology role and I was working on qualification of aluminium, we talked about alternative processing, and my line manager just said, we can print aluminium powder here. I was like, what is this witchcraft? Let me see. So it was, I was dragged in front of an EOS M270, and that was my first real interaction with what is 3D printing proper. We'd done a little bit at university, and then we had a lecturer who was keen on it. He was, I guess, one of the early educators involved in some form of printing. I call it printing because it was distinctly different to what I would say additive manufacturing is. But yeah, it was pretty much straight in front of an EOS talking about lasers and all of these things. It was that was my first meeting with John Meyer. So he's now CEO of AppWorks, and he's pretty much my introducer of AM, and has been a great help on my AM journey since then. And he's a really knowledgeable and equally quite interesting guy. He talked very recently at a UK additive manufacturing event, and he talked about his journey through the excitement phase and then the lull of reality before trying to get on the path of enlightenment, and all the dates he was plotting. Actually, he was at the peak of his excitement the day I met him, or not the day I met him. Maybe, you never know. Maybe I was the best. It's
all downhill after he met you.
But it literally was all downhill. His date's on the slide, and a couple of people in the audience, they like knew me from those days. They looked around, they were like, "Wow, is this anything to do?" And I was like, "There's a strange coincidence here," and I haven't pulled him up on it yet, but I will have to ask him and see whether it was all down to me. But I think that's an interesting point, because we do that. That was oh my God, what is this thing? This is the first, especially at Airbus, in commercial aviation in particular, the magnitude of the way that we import billets and machine them and then get them fitted in the final assembly lines at Wing before we then go over to final aircraft assembly. It was just beyond the comprehension of reality. Even if you went and saw all those things, it was just too big. But now all of a sudden, this fridge freezer looking thing next to a little cabinet with some widgets and some whatnots. There was something about the scale of it for me which completely and utterly changed my perception of what I wanted, and that was it. After that point, I was 100% additive focused. I couldn't get away from it, and yeah, I've never been into a local electronics shop and been inspired by a fridge freezer, so I don't know what it was. It was something to do with the tangibility, I think, of making parts live. I think there was something about that which really caught me.
Were you doing like ripping out builds and setting up builds and
So
like the whole workflow? What were you kind of specifically doing at the time?
So in that point, it was pure introduction, and it was a very interesting conversation because the machine was in our research and development organization, and it was very early days for the organization to be acquiring data. But actually, looking back, that was one of the very earliest conversations between the kind of the qualification body, which was me and Materials and Process, and my boss and the team. It was us actually starting the conversation about, well, this is what you need to do to qualify this thing. And it was very shortly after that period of time that through John and the head of aluminium of the whole of Airbus, which is a really cool job title if you're into aluminium or aluminum, sorry for our American listeners. But Matthias Knuber, who's another big factor in my life, which is why I'm name dropping. Matthias was a fantastic supporter. We sat in a pub in Bristol, and I said, Matthias, I'd really like to live in Germany. So any additional internships I can do when I finish here? And he said, yeah, okay. You can come and do a summer, that's fine. What do you want to do? Friction stir welding or additive manufacturing? And February, I had a decision to make, flick a coin, what do I want to do? Friction stir welding or additive? I chose additive straight away. And that was then actually that early conversation on the M270. My role then with the Airbus commercial hats on was to write the first draft specifications for how do we actually qualify the material and the powders for metal AM, focused on titanium. So yeah, though at that point I had no real interaction with the machine except for having a little look around and opening the doors and seeing what was going on. But it was the start of working quite closely with that team on behalf of Airbus Commercial to try and figure out how do we qualify this thing. So I've been very fortunate, I think, in terms of timing. I've been cheeky enough, I guess, to just go and ask, because it's amazing what people will do for you if you ask. You don't realize how many problems they've got, and until you ask them, and if you're happy to fill them. And that was where the qualification bit started, which is kind of the majority of my experience and exposure with additive has been on statistical validation, qualification, powders, process, parts. And that journey took me to qualifying flying hardware. Not many people have managed to sign a form to qualify hardware. Not many people have designed process qualifications for AM. So I'm in a very fortunate little group. But equally, I've had this conversation at a few conferences. You look back and you think about the things you wrote in these specifications. Now that you're a bit wiser and you know a bit more, you think, oh God, why were you so restrictive? And I think it kind of, my career has shown the same progress that hopefully we're getting to with additive, which is you go from a complete lack of understanding or there's so much overexcitement about the possibilities from end to end that you panic and you freeze it all. And then actually you start to slowly unpick it and you build up that kind of link back to what we said about becoming a process metallurgist with a digital thread. I mean, creating that type of engineer is what's turned us into additive people eventually. And unfortunately, the specifications that we were writing were all based on our current level of understanding or current level of ability to absorb all of this information.
And how long did you end up staying at Airbus?
So it was, I think it was pretty much 5 years, almost to the day in total, where the bulk of it was with additive. There was a few other little projects which I was, which I took up, which I wanted to do as, I guess, as a dip check to make sure I hadn't committed too early to AM. But I did some work with fatigue. I did some work with major wing test, and that was an excellent experience to try and build up that backpack of tools that I need to go on this additive expedition. So that was 5 years in that role. And then adulting happens, and the boy from Preston and had gone to Bristol, and it's probably a love story. A girl followed me down, and then we got engaged, we got married, and we wanted to settle down, and all those things. And we decided we wanted to come back home to the northwest of England. So that was the kind of major contributor to me leaving Airbus, alongside a few other frustrations with that gut feeling thing again, where I was just desperate to try and learn as much about additive, but learning about additive doesn't necessarily help us sell aircraft. And you've got to find a balance between being productive and being knowledgeable. And I think I got to a stage where I wanted to learn more than the organization was going to let me learn because of other priorities. So I had to make a decision about my priorities in that field, and that was what led me to leave. And then I created my own business, Additive Manufacturing Solutions Ltd. I created it because I was told me to as I was leaving. We left on
what year? What year was this, or what kind of time?
This is 2017.
Okay.
2017. So we created a business, and it was purely because my friends at Airbus, my friends at GKN said, "Oh well, do it. Maybe we need some help." And I googled how the hell do I set up a business. And apparently, it's £12 and a couple of forms. So there we go.
$500 in the US. It depends on state by state, I guess.
It's a bargain. It's a bargain over here in the UK. But but I was very fortunate in that latter stage of qualification. I started to rub shoulders with a couple of suppliers, and one of them introduced me to I think he was a VP of additive for an American firm, and that was Mr. John Barnes, who I think most people involved in additive and probably not additive know John, and that was John actually left around the same time I was leaving Airbus, and he then hit me up not long after I'd left and said, "If you ever thought about setting up a company, maybe we could help me out. I'm setting up this thing we're calling the Barnes Global Advisors. Maybe you could help out." So I never got the Airbus gig. They asked me to, and then they sent me the supply chain policies and the procurement policies, and basically that was never gonna happen. So my business basically then for probably 4 years was bits and pieces of consultancy alongside a day job at a university in the northwest of England, trying to change the direction of education in engineering. And my additive journey was building additive into a curriculum. So I did the qualification bit, and then it was, okay, I fell into this career. How do I help other people fall into this thing? Surely it can't just be me who loves this big fridge thing. And I think I've had a nice little impact. There's quite a few of my students who've gone on to have or having careers in additive or materials technology in a wider sense. So there's something about the practitioner becoming the educator and trying to inspire the next generation that I fell for, I guess. And I wanted to try and do that alongside it. And my business really was an opportunity for me to be industrially relevant, keep talking to people like you and anybody else I could possibly find, just to learn what's going on. In particular, the UK has been quite stagnant. Not a lot has really gone on for quite a while with AM. There's lots of people who've developed significantly, the big boys who you would imagine. But ultimately, in terms of general adoption and the funding of adoption and the openness to it, I think we're quite significantly behind the US in particular. And but in the last 12 or so months, there certainly seems to have been a little bit of a turning of the tide, and we're starting to see more and more interest, which means that people like me with a business name that says additive in it have been hit up on Google and whatnot, and I think all of a sudden it starts to build up more organically, and maybe in many ways I was too early to the party as a UK engineer in those days in 2017 to try and have the type of impact I was thinking about having. But I think we're slowly getting there in the UK, and there's lots of interesting opportunities and projects and things going on over here, which I listened to a lot of the talks recently at AMOG and some of the bits and pieces online that the ASTM are posting, and there's certainly not as big of a gap anymore between the kind of current level of projects in the US and some of the stuff that I think is going on in the UK. Maybe it's a little bit of the being British thing and not talking about it as much as we should openly, which is a big problem. But we're slowly getting there, and I'm really excited to be able to kind of be here as a business owner doing this for real, I guess, now, and not just as a side gig for industrial relevance.
And how was it going from big aerospace company, pretty structured, bureaucratic, to the exact opposite, to like, hey, you're your own boss. I mean, you were doing the university stuff, so that kept some structure, but from a business operating perspective, how did you handle that?
Yeah, not well. In reality, man, not well. I think I'm very process orientated. I always have been, um, and so far I've found myself spending so much time developing processes that I'm forgetting to remember that that's not necessarily going to be the thing that pays the bills, and so it is difficult knowing that you need to do a bit of all of it. What I am learning, and what I've been fortunate enough to experience at the university, is actually sometimes no process can work as long as you know what you're doing and how you're doing it, and you keep it small and you can be agile. And there's benefits in the lack of process. I guess I'm trying to be as adaptable as possible, so that, you know, in some conversations we need to make sure we've got every process under the sun ready to be written out and controlled and monitored and discussed. But in some cases, actually, part of the reason why things haven't developed is there is no agility in research. There's no, and that's an international flaw. That's inevitable with bureaucracy and processes and size of these organisations and the size of the pay packets that you know, the DoD or the DOE or the UK equivalents are offering to universities and research centres. So I'm trying to be lean and light as possible in terms of our management of how we process, and trying to be a little bit more forward thinking in terms of the dynamicism that I expect of people to work with me or for me. But equally, in some cases, as soon as you then go back into those conversations with the big aerospace primes or the space, you know, the existing kind of traditional space manufacturers, process is key. But I think, you know, maybe one for you to talk as well. You maybe have more experience, but the wave of startups, the space startups, the forward-thinking automotive startups who don't come from a background of SAE and ASTM specs as their traditional kind of start point. What do you think in terms of is that lack of process evident? Have you worked with any of those newer teams who are actually they're just doers? Is that a thing? It seems that way, but I've not actually experienced it.
Yeah, I mean, it's always a balance, I think. I think the harsh reality is that most people hate making decisions. And in a big company, it's easy to not make decisions, right? In a small company, it's harder to do that. And so I think it leans towards more people that want to keep the ball rolling forward or keep the momentum. And often that's at the expense of things like standards and processes. And I think you can get away with that for a decent amount of time until you find a market, until you find the application. I think on the other end of the spectrum, it's really hard as a new business owner to go and say, like, I've got my 3-year plan of here's my business model, X, Y, and Z, right? Because no one can predict the future. Like, I think my biggest learning, or one of my biggest learnings is I think the only good plan is a flexible plan, right? Like, you could spend years making the perfect plan, but that doesn't exist. So if you can be flexible, I never wrote a business plan for anything that I've done. Like, you kind of talk to people, you say, hey, like, do you need help with this? Or we see there's a software opportunity to do this, and you kind of try it. And the reason I like being a kind of independent small entity is I get to make the decision. I can say, hey, let's try it. And like this podcast, like, if I'm in a big company, like, the first thing they're gonna ask is like, oh, how many listens do you have? Like, what's your link? Like, all the stuff, like the metrics and things that, like, look, this isn't Joe Rogan, right? Like, I'm not getting 10 million people listening to someone, no offense, talk about additive, right?
Not yet.
But like that, you're looking at it like, I think if you're in different environments, they look at it a different way than I would look at it, in terms of longer term kind of opportunities and just trying stuff out and getting conversations started.
Yeah, I like that. I think that kind of rings true with the lack of opportunity in some cases, or at least the promotion internally at large companies to just go and talk to people. I think is interesting. I spoke to we'll name drop. I spoke to the SDM yesterday. We was talking about the consortium, and we was talking about who the members of the consortium, the data consortium in particular. And I was talking to a former kind of opposition at GK when I was at Airbus, in Martin White, who we're both British, and we talked about the lack of European entities on that list. And I think there's still a mentality in the UK and Europe to just let's not talk about it because this is our IP or this is our whatever, and the secret thing just doesn't work. And that's one thing I really like about small businesses, but I think even in some forward-thinking businesses, let's just talk about it. Our process is probably our IP that gives us the leg up, that gives us the part quality, that gives us the reason why the big boys want to work with us. That's ours. We're keeping that. But let's talk about everything else because you can still talk without necessarily showing all your secrets. And that's one thing I found at the large companies is there's no promotion to talk. And there's one quote I always think of. There's always some exceptions to the rule in the big companies. The chief engineer on A350 Wing, he once said to me to make sure that once you've proven yourself, you then need to start making sure that you get ready to ask for forgiveness instead of permission. And progress is significantly better than panic. And I think that always rang true with me is just be the decision maker, make it based on facts. And I quite like a spreadsheet and I quite like some stats to back me up a little bit for confidence maybe or comfort, but just make a decision. And I think that's probably part of the reason why I'm here as a very, very small business owner. Let's make some decisions. They might not always be right, but let's make them based on what we think people are needing, what people are asking for, rather than what we don't know because we don't talk.
And what's your vision for the business? Do you want to give kind of what's your pitch? What do you want to be doing? So what are people paying you for to do?
Yeah,
and how close are those?
So, pizza delivery is definitely on the table if it doesn't go well. But I think I agree on the business plan side. Like I spent quite a lot of time being quite analytical about where do I think the market will go and not go in terms of metal AM in the UK and qualification, etc., etc. And actually, you just can't predict it. So what I have got is a 18-month, and let's call it a plan. But that's because I have visibility of the direction that these things are. I've got an idea of when the projects would start, where the funding would come from, who's going to pay what and why. So in terms of us as a business, I'm making recruits. There's offers on the table for my kind of first staff this week, which is super exciting. But ultimately, I want to support people. So whether we use the dirty word of a consultant or whether we call it support services, we want to support people, and there's packaging for that. So to try and support the adoption of additive, some small organizations, in particular small organizations, but not necessarily limited to, they maybe will go, and I've had this a couple of times, so it's part of the offering. They will approach a machine reseller or an OEM and say, oh, yeah, I think we can afford to buy a machine. We'd like this type of part printing. And they'll go, that's fine. Here's a quote for obscene amounts of thousands of pounds or dollars. And even if they've got the money to do it, they then go, okay, well, we need to put some powder in it, I think, or some wire or whatever our thing is. And we need to then do something at the back end. And I do wonder whether there's just so much fear about the unknown with organizations trying to adopt it, especially if they actually have a tangible benefit, but they don't necessarily have the skills to understand what to do. So I want to try and be, and I've described it a few times as, imagine being the pub landlord, bringing people together and partnering and sharing. So I don't have significant overheads. I'm not into selling a machine, but what I will be able to do is act on your behalf to get the right discounts. I'll be able to bring you the idea of what the full package needs to look like. I'll be able to help you with training at most levels. So that's the kind of cool. And that's exactly how I've described it. Yeah, an additive integrator, where maybe rather than you go direct where there's very little discount, maybe there is a little Rob Higham rate that I can get because I know people and I can try and help them with a sale. And actually, could I get you a bunch of hardware, install it, integrate it, advise you on software training, etc. And actually, could it be cheaper than if you was to go and get quotes individually? Maybe. I've run a couple of Excel sheets that will suggest the expected RRPs versus some of the potential discounts I think I'd be able to negotiate. Maybe that's the thing. Not a core business strand, but certainly something I'd like to do to try and have an impact. Training, obviously, as part of that is really core. So I offer training, and I'm trying to do it as much as possible in partnership with other organizations who maybe are better known than me, but also because we want to try and take metal AM training mostly, but not necessarily limited to metal AM, but we want to try and take metal AM training to people who don't necessarily know where to go and find it. So we're using, in the UK, we have a bunch of professional bodies, kind of the people who will help you on your route towards professional registration, like chartership. So I'm working very closely with the IOM3, which is one of it's the biggest one for materials. It's one of the bigger ones in the UK. So I will deliver the metal AM training. I'm talking to a few other organisations about that so that's the heart, that's the bit which floats my boat. I want to have an impact. But alongside that, there's no real commercial thing there longer term. There's lots of opportunities, but it will be sporadic. It's difficult to predict. So I'm looking at then how do I take that on? So maybe there's a training school option with some kind of partnerships and things. But the final kind of bigger strand is I want to be agile R&D for hire. So organizations can approach us and we can provide this kind of aerospace grade qualification platform. So whether it's utilizing modern machinery, some of the people you've already had on the podcast talking about things like plastometry as a method of gathering data, stress strain curves, rather than the traditional tensile coupon. So can we support everything from parameterization through to novel materials or new alloys, etc.? I want to be able to offer that as a service, and my partner network, as I'm calling it, includes universities and some other companies who maybe already have the machines. So why would someone who's a bureau want to do R&D? There's a lot of time involved, but actually in a partnership, it's mutual, where the bureau can sell me machine time. Doesn't matter what we put on it, let me worry about that, and then I'll do all of the legwork, I guess, in the R&D. And that's the plan. And within that, there's a few specifics. So there's the kind of software, hardware interaction side of things in terms of some advanced processing, maybe advanced or more advanced laser profiling, and some of these other weird and wonderful things that some software providers are offering these days. But also then in terms of feedstock, so that the UK's, we're a very small little island, we're isolated more than ever. So I'm looking at opportunities to try and provide novel or alternative feedstocks or data on some of the plethora of really interesting sounding American-based alloys from all the companies who actually aren't really offering a huge amount on UK shores yet because there's not been the uptake. SIPK, Elementum, Uniformity Labs, etc., etc. So to get that, some of that needs to be paid for by companies. I'm not just no able to do it for charity, but the UK does have ample government funding, not necessarily as accessible, I believe, as American makes and some of the other things from the DoD, etc. But it certainly is there. So we're going to try and work with partnerships and some other bits and pieces of steady state work we do already to kind of co-fund or part fund or fully fund some of that development. And I want to just be a data store of potential opportunities, and as part of that, I'll inevitably then become, dare I say, a master user of certain bits of software, maybe, and hardware, etc. So I think there's lots of spin-offs, but at its core, agile R&D. What do you need to know? I might have already done it, and I can just give you the data in exchange for a small sum of pounds and pence, or we'll go and do it for you. And I think that's what I'm hoping allows us to continue for many years, because that's something that I will certainly enjoy doing. And as a wise man once always told me, and a wise woman once told me when I was a young boy, follow your gut and do what you enjoy. And as long as I'm not in crippling debt, then I think we would have done a good job of that, if we can keep doing what we enjoy.
Yeah, awesome. It's a good journey. So as we kind of think through the last couple of questions of today, first one, what's exciting you about the rest of 2023? You just came off of AMUG and we saw you chatted there. Anything really exciting? Obviously, you've got kind of this company and all the excitement from that. But from an industry perspective, what's kind of what's your gut telling you of is the recession here? Are people pulling back? Are there like are people going full steam ahead? What do you see?
I think so. I'll approach this in two ways. Globally, I think some of the portability of machines that could make our lives easier to get the right data so we could develop more rapidly, so our process become more robust. So whether that's to do with the kind of plastometer side or whether that's chemical composition, there's so many desktop accessible methods in which we can get quality data rapidly. And I think that's quite an exciting opportunity. So hopefully by the end of the year, we'll start to see less talk of this multi-month parameterization, optimization activities that we see in the big companies. Actually, we should be able to do that in hours and days. That really should be much quicker than that. And I think those technologies will enable that. Globally as well, alongside that, the software it's crazy. The amount of new organizations or relatively new organizations offering all of these bells and whistles which didn't exist before. So I'm very excited to see whether we can actually start to push materials further than we did before, and then we'll stop talking about no worse than forged properties and or slightly better than cast properties. Maybe all of that will go away, and we'll start to be able to really push materials. If we can push our material, decrease our scatter, we will be able to decrease the mass of a part, which decreases the mass of an aircraft. So then we'll have an impact, a real impact on our environmental and sustainability. Locally, then, more locally in the UK, I'm really excited about the opportunities that seem to be opening up for larger collaborations between the big boys and some of the little boys in digitalization generally, not necessarily just additive, but the kind of uptake for robotics and software integration and additive is definitely part of that. Smart materials and the sustainability side. There's lots of that work. How I see that direction going is not necessarily too clear, because I think there's so much development in alloys, for example, but there's not necessarily the process capability in the country to be able to do that. So I'm hopeful and I'm expecting that there'll be a more defined strategy in the UK, which will allow us all to be able to follow a path, not necessarily the same as AM Forward, but maybe that type of thing, which starts to instigate a general well-trodden pathway that people should follow. So not necessarily the most exciting thing, but it's a really good start considering the amount of years that I've been kind of left idle in additive in the UK. What about you? I'm really keen to hear what you think.
Yeah, I mean, I think echoing a lot of what you saw. I mean, I think the reality is we just need to make this cheaper. Right? Like no one's going to adopt it if it's $1 million and 18 months and $1.5 million to qualify a machine and a system, especially in metals, right? Like what small company is going to do that? You can't. Most big companies aren't going to invest in a fleet of these systems. And so it's an interesting time. I think a lot of, certainly in the US, a lot of government money coming in. There's industries that are hot, right? Space, for example, but is that sustainable? Is that going to be in 3 years, 5 years, going to be the same as what it is now? And so how do you establish kind of connections through traditional manufacturers, the broader supply chain? That's what I'm really interested in. It's kind of the mechanics on the ground. Is like, how do you support growth in not just big companies, but people that are buying their first or second machine, and supporting that infrastructure in a way that's cost effective, and people enabled, right? Labor is always going to be a shortage, especially nowadays. And so how do you enable that? So I think there's lots to do. Software is not going to solve it all. Hardware is not going to solve it all. There's still a lot of need for people talking to each other and being collaborative and making decisions, taking risks with the technology.
No, I like it. I think getting the machines out, the smaller machines in particular, the smaller low cost machines, let's just get them out in front of people as well. Let's get them on show. Let's get more people stood in front of these fridge freezer things, and let's get some people inspired, because that's where the shortfall is. It's always in the education and the workforce. So yeah, I'm a big fan of the smaller machines. There's a few. They're all relatively cost effective. I think if you've got a production plan, it'd be interesting to see how productive they are, and whether that fits for those type of organisations. But agile R&D and material development, there's lots of options without you necessarily going to spend $500,000. So
Right.
I think that will help drastically, I would imagine, in terms of just getting people ready. And that's what I've seen in the UK. There's a few people who've approached me about exact metal specifically, for the price. I don't think we could possibly go wrong, type thing. And you can go
Mario's been on the podcast. He's great.
You can go and buy a 3-axis mill for the same price. So why wouldn't we get this thing? And I think that, again, it's that education, it's that opportunity to get in front of the machine and figure out how to actually handle powder properly. And I'm well up for the fight in helping educate, and hopefully we manage to make enough money so my kids can stay off the streets while we do that.
Yeah. So last question, kind of out of left field. What's a book that's inspired you over your career, or that you've read recently, that has helped shape kind of how you think about the technology more broadly, your leadership or entrepreneurship?
So the title is not an ideal one to try and say, so I'll have to censor a word. But
we're not censored. This isn't.
My wife always tells me that I care too much, and I get too irritated at stuff that isn't important. So she bought me a book called The Subtle Art of Not Giving a F.
Oh yeah, I've seen that.
And that one, it's like talking to yourself, because these things, but you're reading it. It's like somebody stood in front of you. The way it's worded, it's just like, just stop it. And it's when you're stuck in traffic and someone's coming slow, but there's a car in front of them. Who cares? And I need to pick that back up again soon and remind myself. And I think that kind of thing is really helpful. In particular, in this small business world, you feel quite isolated, and you've got to remember sometimes you just don't have to care. That's the one that sticks out. Certainly does stick out.
Fantastic. Rob, well, thank you so much for your time today. Good luck with everything. I'm excited to see you at the next event, whether it's in the US or over in the UK or elsewhere. And we'll throw up links to what you're doing. So thanks so much for joining the show.
Thanks, Mike.
Be sure to check out our website, www.3degreescompany.com, for more content.